welcome to the Republican Professor. This morning, we have with us Dr. Brad Elliott Stone. Thank you for being here, Brad.
And thanks for the invite. Glad to be here.
Brad, I'm coming from California. You're also in California?
California, yes.
Mhm. Los Angeles?
Los Angeles, unincorporated Los Angeles, as they historically would say.
Unincorporated, really?
So the move in the 70s to become Westchester, California failed. And so we're still Los Angeles, although outside of the ocean line, we're not actually contiguous to, let's say, downtown LA at all.
Yes, that's right. I oftentimes call it Lost Angeles.
Yes.
But yes, I've been to Westchester many times. And is this your office that you're joining us from?
It is, thanks to a wonderful set of power company efforts today. We were told by the power company that there would be intermittent power outages at home today. And so I said, well, I better come into my office and have a better chance of not having us cut out with a power outage. So.
There you go. Well, it's a very nice office, it's a spacious office, and there's lots of books, which is immediately what I notice. Got that nice natural light. And gosh, it looks like you have hundreds of books there, at least.
Yeah.
Maybe 1,000. I don't know.
Yeah, as I always joke, these are my working books. I actually have more books downstairs, a lot of books at home.
Mm-hmm.
When I became associate dean at the beginning of this academic year, so around May 2021, I asked them to bring in as many bookshelf cases as they could. They couldn't actually drill into the walls to put up my kind of wall shelves that I have downstairs. And so I have these kind of metal bookcases, and then there weren't enough to move up here. And I needed to keep room for my electronic piano behind me. And so I said, well, let me take the books I kind of work with.
You have the piano there.
Bring them up.
You have the piano in your office.
Wow. And so
cool.
Since one big shift from...
You might be the first associate dean that's ever had a piano in the office.
Yeah, it has headphones and everything, so I can kind of practice without
headphones.
Interrupting everybody, although every once in a while people try to listen in.
You got one of those fancy ones with the headphones.
Yeah, well, alas, bring in an acoustic one, I think would be overkill. So I decided, well, if I'm going to be in here during kind of standard business hours, and I'm used to kind of practicing in the early afternoon in my usual life. And so I said, well, if I don't have a meeting, I can just keep practicing.
Right. Now, when you say your usual life, let's say, okay, we got to set the stage here. You are the first administrator that we've had on here. And so when you say your normal life, you mean, are you still full professor? I don't understand how that works. Okay, so you're still full professor of philosophy, right?
Yes, I am. Okay. And so when I say normal life, I usually mean the life of the philosophy professor versus the administrator. And so my wife gets to look at me funny every time I lament, coming in and having to be in an office all day compared to most people in the world.
Right. So that's it. You have now normal business office hours. That's just a part of what it is to be associate dean.
It is. So of course there are meetings, things I'm not always in this room, but kind of a 9 to 5, which although the life of the academic is much longer than 9 to 5, at least it's not in one place. And so you can be at home writing, for example, or grading essays and things like that. Or you're in some other building teaching classes, you're interacting with students, you're getting a cup of coffee with students, or something like that. Whereas this job is more oh, here's an email, and there's a implication that that email should be answered sooner than later, compared to the rule I have for my students, which says, well, if you send me an email, I have a whole day to even first read it, let alone then time to deal with it. And
Good
in this
idea.
position, you don't have that kind of freedom because the pieces are moving so quickly
Mm,
that you have to kind of be ready for that email or a phone call, or some event happens on the campus and there's an expected kind of swiftness of response.
mhm. That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you're teaching it, typically, for those who don't know, typically you're in class as a professor well, actually, it could be up to 3 times a week during the year.
Yes.
I mean, for a specific
Or one
course,
class.
I should
Yes.
say course, yeah. Um, so it might be that you come in every day if that's just what the schedule was.
Mhm.
But typically, if you're what's a full-time professor load there? Is it three
Yeah.
three?
Well, it's a
Two,
3-3.
two?
So
Okay.
at the moment, we're now what's called 2-2-2-3 because we've moved to a 4-unit curriculum. But for the majority of my career, it's been 3 every semester, kind of 2 courses that are part of the core curriculum that every student takes, and then either an upper division course for philosophy majors or a graduate course for our philosophy graduate students. And so sometimes, since I really don't like teaching back to back, I would teach a 3-time-a-week class and a 2-time-a-week class. So I'd still be coming in every day.
Oh,
But then kind of really have all my energy for
yeah.
the one class,
That's
particularly if they're
nice.
the same class.
Mhm.
I always find it weird to teach material and then the next hour kind of teach it again. It feels weird. None of the jokes work.
Yes. Oh,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
you start
Totally.
remembering things said by the other class.
Uh-huh.
And then you have to, so the second class gets usually a richer class in a certain sense, but then I always feel sorry for the people who had me first, because I'm taking the insights from that hour and using it in the second hour. So I
Yeah.
usually actually break those apart so that I'm not doing it. And since they're in different days,
Yeah.
they're at different paces, and it's clearer to keep things straight.
What's the energy differential that in terms of output for you between these required undergraduate courses, which, first of all, yay for required philosophy
Yes.
undergraduate courses,
Yes.
um, uh, between that and teaching a major course or a graduate course?
Well, I would say it's the same energy. It just gets distributed differently. So I love teaching freshmen just because they are kind of doe-eyed and
Mhm.
somewhat innocent.
Yeah.
That's becoming harder and harder to say by the year. But you go in with freshmen and you can really be excited about asking big questions and thinking through big ideas
Right.
and inviting them to a conversation they've never had before
Mhm.
about these kind of ultimate questions. And so a lot of it is energy in the sense of getting them excited. When you're teaching majors, they're already excited about doing philosophy. So you can really
Oh.
tune into the excitement of the figure or the texture dealing with in the class. And so you already have the students' buy-in in a certain way. And now the energy is, look how great this idea is that this philosopher had. So the last course I had for majors was a course on Michel Foucault. And Foucault, of course, is a fascinating person and lived through a France that was going through a lot of unrest, upheaval. Students could kind of see themselves in 1968 France. And how does a philosopher respond? And what kind of questions did Foucault ask in such a time? And they seem counterintuitive to what everyone else was doing at the time. But I think that's part of the beauty of philosophy, is that we ask questions that no one else is thinking to ask. And so I can spend my energy being excited about how Foucault did it. In the graduate courses, the excitement is more now, how do you take these ideas and become a young scholar?
Mm.
There's a little of that in the majors, but definitely by the time you're a graduate student, I always teach graduate courses from the point of view of you're going on. You now think you have something to say. Now, how do you formulate it? How do you try to take your idea and run it as far as you can with it? And of course, as you know, once you start running with an idea, new questions come up and new ideas form. And you just throw away that first batch of writing you did. And now you have something better to say. And so the energy there is telling them to keep pushing and not to be afraid, because some graduate students are kind of afraid of where their ideas are taking them because they're too busy thinking about the market and things like that. And the answer is no, go where the ideas are taking you.
Oh, I like that. Yeah,
So definitely same energy.
if someone missed what you said about the market, that's a kind of a technical term for scholars, the market. You don't mean like the grocery store
No.
or the Brea Mall. Trying to think of a mall that's closer to LA.
Yeah.
I guess the Grove, maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know. I've only been to the Grove once. I wasn't really that impressed. Not that impressed with Brea Mall either, just FYI. But they did have a bookstore. They did.
Yes.
They just lost the bookstore.
I'm about to say, back in the golden age of bookstores that we no longer have.
Yeah, well, they just lost this bookstore just a few months ago, and I really torn up about it. They had a great bookstore there. It's a used bookstore. But yeah, so your comment about the market and how that, what do you mean by that?
Well, for our graduate students, our philosophy program is a master's program. And so it's what we call pre-PhD master's program. MA programs kind of divide into two. Some are what we call post-baccalaureate. Because, oh, you have your undergraduate, now here's some more education. Our master's approaches things as a pre-PhD, which means that you are on your way to PhD programs. How do we make sure you're ready? How do you have the skills to be successful in the PhD world? Now, of course, there's so few slots in PhD programs that it does build a kind of competitive market where programs get to pick who comes. And so for grad students, the market can mean the PhD programs. In the PhD level, the market usually means the job market. And now it's the market in the more usual sense of, once again, you having to peddle your wares and be hired by institutions. And of course, in philosophy, there are not, or any field really, there are not as enough jobs for everyone who has a doctorate degree. So the market becomes the peddling of oneself. And I'm trying to convince graduate students to think less about that and more about what we could call the profession. And you got to hear professing there, not just in the sense of being a professor, but in the sense of professing that we have something to say, things we want to share, ideas for the world. And I think we're in a current moment where students think less, in the graduate level at least, they think less about their own ideas, and they're so worried about whether they're going to get a job that they really don't do philosophy.
Oh, wow.
In the way we sell to our
that's
freshmen.
Huge what you just said. That's huge what you just said.
So when we teach freshmen philosophy, it's all about love of wisdom and seeking big questions. And that sounds true, and it's true even for people in graduate school, but sometimes this worry about jobs makes them forget that that's the calling of philosophy. My wife, who was my fiancée at the time, anytime I expressed any nervousness about jobs, she reminded me two things. One, she said, you can be a philosopher even if you worked at a gas station. That dates me, back when people worked at gas stations and pumped gas. You could be a philosopher pumping gas,
Cool.
And
That is an old school comment right
that
there.
is an old school concept. And also, I love you no matter what.
Uh,
That helped
uh-huh.
with that. But I try to convince students, just be yourself, have good ideas, go where they take you. If they're any good, people will be interested. But we have to start thinking about education writ large, independently of the economic question. I say that knowing it sounds too idealistic, but the goal of education is education to be built a certain surely.
It sounds pure to me.
Yeah.
To me, it sounds like there's a purity to what you're saying. Well, I really like, I triple underlined profess in profession. That's interesting. I don't think I'd ever had that thought before.
Yeah.
Professing in a profession, and being a professor is a classic profession.
Yes.
This strikes, well, how do your students respond to this challenge to take, and I'd be interested in, how do you do that? How do you take the fear of the market or the worry of getting a job and put it to one side when it seems like it's clouding maybe your vision of the material itself, like the the you called it the calling of philosophy. That's another interesting word that you used, was the calling. I'd love to hear what you see about what do you mean by the calling of philosophy?
Well, I mean, we could, of course,
almost like a Christian term.
It is. Well, for me, it is, of course. But there's I mean, to keep with the wordplay going, I mean, the word vocation literally means to be
yes.
called.
Oh, yeah.
And so preachers have vocations. They were called to preach. I wish, I see my being a professor similarly. I think I'm called to it. I don't think the younger people now today say the industry, that people would even use the word industry to describe higher education, just bothers me. No, the profession, the academy, the professorate. So we need to return, I think, in higher education to a sense of calling, and that we are here for those who have received such a calling. And my students will quickly remind me that does sound idealistic, but it's almost more that it's old-fashioned. I don't think it's non-realistic. I think it's old-fashioned. It's harder and harder for people to now see education as a leisure activity. Philosophy requires leisure.
Yes.
It's hard for people to see going to college as a place where one finds oneself and where one grows and lives in a land of ideas. Your parents using the phrase return on investment, which is just cringeworthy as a term. And of course, my students remind me that my entire college education cost me less than one semester of theirs. And so they do have real worries. But the problem with that
was that because you had scholarships, or was that just because I
did have scholarships, but the actual retail price, as it were, of the education was still less than a semester.
Wow, really?
Now, of course, this was early 90s in Kentucky.
I
grew up in Kentucky.
All right, so you're yes. So you're in Los Angeles, but you grew up in Kentucky.
I grew up in Kentucky. I grew up in rural Kentucky.
Oh, wow.
And so I was one of a handful of people.
No wonder you're old-fashioned.
Yeah. Well, I would say sensible.
There you go.
But some of it is
sensible.
I was just one of the few people from my high school class who went to college. Several of them have gone since, just as the world has made everyone have to go to college.
Right.
But there was a time, even into the early 90s, where you didn't have to go to college. And so when you went
once upon a time,
it really was more idealistic. You could practically almost fell out, as my uncle would joke, some people graduate cum laude, others graduate oh lordy. And but you still had a college degree, and that was sufficiently differentiating between you and other people. So most of the people I went to college with, I went to a Baptist college in Kentucky, Georgetown College, marvelous Baptist college.
I've heard of it.
And had great instruction there. But everyone there was either going to become a school teacher, a preacher, a couple were going to be lawyers, some knew they might become professors. I didn't go to college to become a professor in the university sense, but to be a high school teacher.
Really?
And
that's why you went to college?
That's why I went to college. If it had not been for that, and
really?
The fact that I hated tobacco gum on my hands, I would have just stayed on the farm. And that was an option back then.
Okay.
Or, you still had factories and people would work in manufacture. My father had his entire career on the farm and in a hydraulic pump factory.
Wow.
And had a good middle-class life in the Midwest we'd consider a good middle-class life. What I see now is a lot of students paying ridiculous prices, who have no inclination to live a life that would need kind of an academic focus. And they come almost begrudgingly to school, and they're going to rack up all this debt. And if most of the jobs they're going to have didn't require that degree. So I know I'm from an older time when people didn't have to go to college for most careers out there.
Yeah.
And so that meant the people who were in college really were there to be there. And I grew up in a small town, and I was fascinated when I got to Georgetown, which is not a big town at all, but it's outside of Lexington, and University of Kentucky's right there. Transylvania University's there, not too far from Center College. Those are kind of your big.
How far out of Lexington is it?
Lexington was about a 30-minute drive.
Okay.
And 30 minutes in Kentucky versus the 30 minutes out here in California. So this is like 30 miles away.
Good distinction.
Yeah. Where I drive 30 miles to go,
so it's not a couple blocks away, in other words.
Right. But what was nice is you had brilliant kids, mostly from Kentucky, but some from across the country, and a couple of people who were international at the time, who really were smart. And I really was pressed. I was kind of a big fish in a little pond. And then you find yourself in the ocean, and you go to professors' houses, going back to the notion of books, and they have books everywhere in their house, let alone in their office. And I decided, I want that life.
Oh, yeah.
I want the
now,
life.
how was this a freshman? Did you have
Yeah,
this
in my
right
freshman
away?
year, we had professors who lived near campus, and they would invite you to their homes. And so you saw their professorial life. And
Yes.
I said, I want that life. And that's when I decided I wanted to be a professor. The college was small enough that once I told a couple of people I wanted that, they knew that. And so then my professor started pushing me about that. Well, that's an okay paper, but if you want to be a professor down the road, you need to think this way, not that way. You need to read these books. They're not for a class that we have, but these are the books you will need for literacy to then go to grad school, and so I had a lot of mentoring.
Wow.
Some of that was
that whole thing about not
school.
for a class, that's a big thing for an undergrad.
Yeah.
Do you do that for your undergrads here in LA?
I try to. There's a lot of things that get in the way. It's very hard to have students at your home just because travel and distances from where I live.
Do you live close to the campus at all?
I do not. I live about 20 minutes away. I mean, it's close in my Kentucky sense. It's like 5 miles away. But to get students over there is kind of a chore.
It is.
And of course, things are just different now. There's a nervousness about bringing students to your home.
Really?
or having,
Okay.
these kinds of personal mentoring relationships that
So there,
exceed the boundaries of the campus
uh-huh.
in the same way.
Because of litigious nature of our context,
I suspect so.
would you say? Okay.
I suspect so. And of course, litigiousness
Or is
of
it just a,
contemporary American society, let alone higher education,
yeah,
makes it really difficult for people to do some of the things, even in administration, that one would want to do. But at my institution, we have like a dozen university attorneys full time, plus a whole cadre of others on retainer, and there's literally on any given day dozens of lawsuits, from grades to interactions on campus, students even suing each other, and does the university get involved in some of those cases?
you're
It can
depressing
be
me.
really tricky
Oh my gosh.
compared to when I
Wait.
was in college.
Okay, so this I gotta stop you here. Hold on a sec. Okay. Now going back to the professors and homes and stuff, you had that right away in college, and you were able to see what you call the professorial life. I totally relate to that
Mhm,
because I had a mentor in high school who was a philosophy professor at Denver Seminary. His name was Gordon R. Lewis.
mhm.
And he would invite us over to his home once a week when I was a senior. And I saw for myself, I don't think I was able to take it in, looking back on it. I don't think I ever fully took it in what this is philosophy. I don't think I understood it totally, but I was able to see it and have those memories of all these books lining the people don't understand, lining the hallways, like on the floor. Like it would be considered inappropriate in a normal home, but it was totally fine. If for some reason you walked in and you were like, well, of course he's going to put it on the floor. Where else is he going to put it? But most of them were in, bookshelves and stuff. But you could just tell they were just stacked up and they were used. And and then he had another office on campus that also had books that were
Yes.
used. They weren't decorative. It wasn't like the encyclopedias that people used to buy. You remember those, right?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Or they had the encyclopedias. I mean, I read them, but most people most people didn't, and they were like just sitting there, and they were pretty to look at, I guess. I mean, I don't know. I actually liked looking at them, but my gosh, I wonder whatever happened to those dang things. I don't even know. But anyway, now that's kind of lost. That purity of what you're talking about, going to college, getting lost in ideas. You mentioned that going to a professor's house to see the professorial life, to see these books, to see the type of schedule that would allow for, I mean, Gordon had the type of schedule that would allow for having two seniors in his home, I think on a Tuesday. I can't remember when we were. I mean, it was,
Yeah.
but it was, he wasn't booked with meetings, and he had that kind of time to spend with these books. And there was not a nervousness like you're talking about. I do not remember
Right.
that at all. Of course, it might have been that a he went to the church that was in our neighborhood, but I think even then, nowadays, there would be that nervousness. But
Mhm.
yes, he um he was a local, as we call them. 2 blocks away or 3 blocks away from the home I grew up in was a church. It was a Baptist church, and he was a member there.
Yes.
And so that's the contact. That's why we had the contact that we had. I didn't go to that church, but my friend did, Robbie Blanks. But do you lament that that was your experience and that's not how the students there experience college? Is that a
It
lament for
is.
you?
It is a lament for me, but I'm also aware that we're just in a different world.
Mhm.
That's some of it. I remind students that I went to college, and it wasn't until my junior year that we had the internet in any common standard way. I first
So
got
you got
online.
letters. You wrote letters
We
to these
wrote letters.
professors.
We had actual, card catalogs. You go to the library
Oh, even
and
better.
you would either say, I need this book, and you're looking through the cards to find where it is in the shelves. But the beautiful thing there is, you'd look up something in the card catalog, and then you'd go to the stacks, and you'd realize there's the book to the left or to the right of it. There's the book on the shelf above it, the book on the shelf below it. Or sometimes you just go to the library and just peruse down an aisle and see what just grabs your attention. It could be on anything, and I try to convince
Browsing the stacks.
my students. We still have the stacks at my institution, and
Sure.
we have a marvelous library. And I just wonder how many students have wandered through those stacks. Now everyone just looks things online,
Mhm.
and they don't find anything they weren't already looking for.
Right.
And so
Very different
going,
experience.
there's
There's no
yeah.
that's a very different experience because there's no sense of surprise.
Right.
Like I remember loving the stacks because I was always surprised.
Yes.
And it was great. It was like, oh, I would have never looked that book up.
Mhm.
And I'm going to take a look at it. And you look at the table of contents, you look at maybe dip into a chapter, maybe if it's got some blurbs on it, but the older ones didn't have blurbs on them. You just had to get into the book,
Yeah.
You didn't read what somebody else said about the book before you read it. You just read it. You thought about it for yourself.
Mhm.
Now there's all sorts of blurbs and you have to wade through all these blurbs, reading what everybody else thinks about the book before you look at it yourself. And then sometimes that might not even, that means you're doing that instead of looking at it for yourself.
Yeah.
It's such a pure, that is the idea that I had
Mhm.
when I was young of what college meant. So you obviously like books, Brad.
Oh, yes.
How did you get into books? You said you grew up on a farm. You mentioned
Yes.
tobacco.
Yes, I grew up on a farm. Tobacco was the cash crop of Kentucky at the time. When I say that to students now, they look at me weird, and I'm like, "That's right. Your, relatives' emphysema paid for my school clothes." But
Did you
on
smoke?
the other
Did you
hand,
chew?
I do not chew. I do smoke, but I do not chew.
Okay.
Even though there was this kid who lived next door to my grandfather. My grandfather had a farm as well near where I grew up. So my brother and I would ride our bicycles and stuff to my grandfather's place all the time. And in the summer, you're working on the farm. That was your kind of
Okay.
summer task.
Was that by
And
choice or was that
no, it was
assigned
not
to
by
you?
choice. It was, it's summer's here, you're not in school, you work. And
Mhm.
we would pick rocks out of the field or strip tobacco, shell peas, the farm life. The good news there, of course, was those peas you shelled were going to be the peas you ate. The potatoes you were digging up would be the potatoes you ate.
Wow.
You actually had a real connection.
And you
with the
knew
work
that
you're doing
while
and the
you were
food
doing
you're
it? You knew that there was a connection between you doing this and it showing up in your belly at some point.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Because
That's a very interesting I think that's a valuable thing for a kid. How old were you?
Yeah. Well, from infancy, I lived on the farm till I left for college. And then summers back, a couple of times.
You were an infant working in the summers?
Well, in the sense of when you were a little kid, there were jobs that were helpful for little kids to do. So when it was time to plant tobacco, a kid could take the peg, as we'd call it, which is kind of the wooden stake that you'd hit the ground with after you've tilled to make the hole, and then you put the tobacco slip into the hole. And then the other kid would have like a little water can and put some water in the hole, and then you would bunch it up, and then you would plant the row that way.
Okay.
Now, inside the
Wow.
bigger field, you'd have a tractor and you actually have a slip device that will do that
Uh-huh.
for you. But on the edges and where the machine messed up, you'd have to go in and manually peg the
Oh,
tobacco.
wow.
And so pegging was a job that like a kid would do. When it was time for stripping tobacco, you could always pull the leaves off the stalk, you know, and stuff like that. You know, we didn't have to lift the, you know, stalks up into the rafters of the barn for drying or anything. Too little for that. But there were ample jobs. Picking rocks after you till the ground. Going, how many rocks? My grandfather, you know, how many rocks can you get? And I
Wow.
was always a competitive kid, and I always wanted to pick more rocks than my brother. And so he got a lot of free labor out of my competitiveness. But at the same time, you know, even using the word labor is a weird term when that literally became the things that you needed for life.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, I grew up in a world where you would still go to the country store and you would get groceries and set them down, as we would say. And they would keep a tab. And then when the tobacco check came, you would go and pay off everyone. And that's when you would buy your new school clothes. That's when you would pay off the country store. So if you ran a country store at that time, you would go months providing and just knowing, you know, people were good for it because you knew their families. And you wouldn't want the shame of having ran up a big tab and then not paid it.
Wow.
And so you would go. And so this rural life was the staple of what we were doing. Now, how that gets to a professor's life, my brother and I both loved books, and my parents invested in books. Just children's books, you know.
Okay.
Both my parents were high school graduates, kind of that first generation of Black people to be high school graduates right after integration. And they really wanted my brother and I to be good at school and things. And so we always had books as a kid. And then one
The way you
family
say
friend,
the way you say that though, you say high school graduate, and I think you mean something by that is kind of lost on people now.
oh, true.
I think what you mean is that the high school was taken very seriously, and that was maybe even a sufficient explanation for why somebody liked books. Is that how you meant it, or
not
was
thoroughly. I meant it more in the sense of just historical situatedness. My parents
they like
are
books?
the first generation in their families to complete high school.
Yeah, right.
So in like
But I
rural
mean,
America, it was not very common for Black people to graduate high school because there weren't high schools for them. So if you were really smart, you would get put up as a boarder at some neighbor church in a bigger town that had a high school for Black people. But until integration, if you weren't one of them, you know, what W.E.B. Du Bois would call the talented 10th, you really probably weren't going to graduate from high school. But my parents came to age after Brown, and Kentucky is one of the first states to really have to deal with the results of the Brown case. And particularly my father's high school, which was one of the special cases about Brown, because a local Black high school that people from 5 different counties would go to burned down. Brown had already passed, so the argument was, well, they can just go to Columbia High School. And everyone said no. And finally, through the work of NAACP and actual implementation of Brown, they still didn't get into Columbia High School. The county actually built a new high school called Adair County High School, which was just already integrated with its entrant class.
what was the
My
name
mother's
of it?
case is a little
What
different.
was the name of the high school again?
Adair County High School. And so for a while, you had an Adair County High School and a Columbia High School. The Columbia High School was still segregated, and the Adair County High School was the integrated school. And then, you know, through busing, like most of the way Brown got implemented, students were forced to go to Adair County High School, basically, along with these Black kids. And
Was it a good high school?
It was. And of course, it was a good high school in the way that in late 1960s United States, high school was big because it was as far as most people got.
Right.
So when I look at my father's report cards from high school, which he had, and he's taking Latin. Why is
Oh, wow. That's cool.
a school in the middle of tobacco country studying Latin? Well, because that's what you studied in high school.
Ah, yeah.
Right. That was part of just what you would learn in a higher education. I'm at a place, I grew up in a place where 8th grade graduation was still very big because it really was the highest achievement of most people. And even
how did your dad do in Latin?
He did well. He went to the army. He was drafted to the army upon graduation, served in Frankfurt, Germany. The Vietnam War ends right before his group was going to be shipped to Vietnam. Comes back to America, tried the city life, went to Louisville, Kentucky for a couple of years, returned to the farm, met my mother at a church event. Because all the Black churches of that area would hold, homecomings in the summer and things, and you'd run into people that way. And so then they stayed in Adair County. My mother's from the neighboring county. But one of the things they did is they bought us books and would read to us. So by the time my brother and I were in kindergarten, we were already strong readers. And this made press because, in small town America, it doesn't take much to make the newspaper. And so there's,
gotta sell
super
those
readers.
papers.
Brad and Jason Stone are reading this book next to, Soap Gibson's award-winning pumpkin for largest pumpkin contest. And this made people become invested in us as readers. And so people who had more access to things would give us things. So my uncle, who lived in Louisville, working at GE in Louisville, would come every weekend to visit my grandparents. And he would give us the Louisville Courier Journals of the week. And of course, my brother and I would first go to the Sunday paper and read the Sunday comics, because Ronald Reagan said that was his favorite part of the paper too. And then we would actually read the paper as children.
You read the whole paper?
We'd try to, and then we'd get these weird questions like who's Manuel.
So that was that would be a big deal then for you to be in the paper.
Yeah, but that really was my textbook, as John Dewey himself argues. Maybe the best education would be just to sit down with the newspaper every day and read it through as a class and talk about the world through the news. But we did that. And then we had a family friend who
how old were you when you got into the newspaper?
6, 7.
That's pretty young.
It was stuff to read.
It was because of books you got into they covered you as a feature.
Well, yeah, because they would do school news back then, because we didn't have a lot to cover in our small town. And so it was hunting photos.
It was you and your brother?
Fishing photos.
Oh, I interrupted you saying hunting photos. I'm sorry.
Yeah, school photos.
Continue.
Things like that. So it's just
hunting photos. Cool.
And so every week the paper would come to your school because you had school programs. And
did you grow up with guns?
That. Sorry?
Did you grow up with guns?
Oh, yes. Well, I mean, you live in rural Kentucky, and you don't want, bobcats coming through. So I always explain to students out here in California that, if you grew up on a farm, you have just a different relationship to guns. But guns also produced food for us.
Okay.
And so, someone would shoot a deer, or, my mother, anyone who got a rabbit needed to call my mother. She wants the rabbit.
So you grew up with, as a young kid, you were around them and you weren't afraid of them?
Not afraid of them. My grandfather gave us a wonderful lesson in gun safety, not in any of the normal senses. So my grandfather had this really good, shotgun, and he would shoot it one-handed. He would keep it on the front porch, and we on Sunday afternoons would be on the front porch listening to the gospel sings on the radio. And different singing groups would go to the radio station and sing, and he would listen on the radio. And you'd see something fluttering across the road, these country roads, something fluttering in the woods. He would just, in one swoop, move his hand over, grab the gun, bring it forth, shoot. And then Ruth, my grandmother's name, Ruth, I got something. Sometimes it was something edible. Other times it was something that people think Kentuckians would eat, but we didn't.
Like what? Like what?
Well, like, people think that people in Kentucky eat possum. I've never eaten possum.
Ew.
But, a squirrel, rabbit, deer, definitely. And
he shot it one-handed?
yes.
A shotgun? Really?
Yeah.
Was it
He was
12
very
gauge?
strong. Yeah. And I mean, we were kids, we would play with shotgun, empty shotgun shells.
Yeah. Was he really strong?
Oh, yes.
Okay, that's the piece I was missing.
Strong,
well, of course he's a farmer, so
yeah, but let's say strong in that old black farmer sense, strengthened by time. But when I was about 4 or 5, my grandfather said, okay, you're gonna shoot the shotgun. And we'd had cap guns and stuff as kids, back when people had those kinds of toys. And
was it pump action? Was it double barrel? Was it
a double barrel shotgun?
Double. Okay.
Just as hammer throw. You didn't have to pump it or anything. And he had me hold this shotgun, and he'd put a tin can on one of the fence posts. And he's like, I want you to shoot this can off the fence post. And here I am, 4 or 5, and not large at all.
What? 4 or 5 with a 12 gauge?
Yeah. And I pull the trigger. Oh, and if this was a Looney Tune cartoon, the gun stays in place and I'm thrown back, like 25. Yeah. And then the gun falls.
Yeah. And you make sure there's no dirt in the muzzle.
Yeah. And then my grandfather, picks up the gun, stares at me and says, "Don't you play with my guns." Yeah, that was the gun safety course. And then as you got older, you realize, okay, you know how to hold it and let the kickback just dislocate your shoulder.
So these are long guns. They're not like handguns. They're not. These are 6-shooters.
These aren't fancy guns. These were practical. Yep. I got to shoot things guns.
Gotcha.
The horse breaks a leg guns. Things like that. But then, my grandfather was in military police when he was in the army. He kept his service pistol, things like that. So I grew up with guns. We had our old, my grandparents had extra guns that then my father has. My great grandfather's hunting gun, things like that. But in that world, you had guns because you ate the result of the gun work. And you go back to that theme. When you're canning food that you're going to eat in the winter, when you shoot the deer meat that you're going to eat in the winter, you have different relationships to these items.
Did you feel safe? What's missing is the issue of self-defense. So
yeah, nobody that I knew talked about guns in terms of self-defense.
Did you did people lock their doors in that area?
No.
Okay.
Now, to be fair, if you tried to break into the house, my dad would have shot you. but
probably people know that, right?
And people know that, right?
Yeah.
And so it's
it's there, but it's just not articulated.
Yeah, you didn't have the gun for self-defense. You had it for hunting.
I got it.
It's one of the items you'd have on a farm.
Yeah. I gotcha.
You have the cow that's just
for something else, but you could deploy it for like an axe.
Right.
But that's not the first thing you think of when you think of an axe is, I need that for self-defense.
So I always joke, I grew up in a world full of dangerous, sharp objects and non-soft landing surfaces.
No kidding.
I went to a school that had gravel underneath the swings. I'm used to having scrapes and cuts, and you go to the school nurse's office, and I don't even think they have this product anymore. It was called methylate, and they would put it on your wounds. And that was it. It was just a rougher, as I tell students, this is why I'm so gritty, is that, I grew up in a world that was not overly kind to children.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up in a world where people had to work and people worked together because you had to. Mm-hmm. Life on the farm also meant barter economies. And so, my grandmother had a lot of chickens, and therefore had the eggs that she could trade for someone else's goods. and neighbors had to live together, because when it's time to plant tobacco, everyone's in the field, and then you're working each other's fields to get all the tobacco planted. And so that kind of
Yeah.
community life
Yeah.
was what I grew up in. And so then, as they had relatives who'd gone off to cities and knew I loved reading, my brother and I started getting, copies of Architectural Digest. And so here we are, little kids reading Architectural Digest.
Just you and your brother, and any other siblings?
No, just me and my brother.
Okay.
And this was right at the time when a lot of people were kind of leaving the farms to go to cities. But we stayed. And there was a family friend who worked for Lindsey Wilson College, which was a Methodist college in Columbia, Kentucky, near where I grew up. I grew up in Sparksville, Kentucky. I went to high school in Columbia, but Lindsey Wilson College.
Was it a black area that you grew up in? Only black?
It was
area?
historically black, but always integrated. I mean, my great grandfather was born a slave and settled in the same area after emancipation, somehow bought land. He was a preacher. It built 4 different churches.
Did you say it was your great grandfather?
Great-grandfather.
One great?
Two greats.
Two greats. Okay.
My great grandfather was also a preacher. And so, but he built these churches. And so you had these kind of black neighborhoods in the South. And of course, recently there's been this argument for blacks to return to the South and to rural life. But there was enough black people, I'll put it that way. You knew that there was something called black culture, but there was no ghettos. So there was no world where you were kind of shut off from white people. I went to school in an integrated grade school all the way through high school, one of the few black people, but we were all from Adair County.
Gotcha.
And all of our families go all the way back to before the Civil War. Columbia, Kentucky was a big revolutionary city for Kentucky.
I bet.
It has a lot of history. So Colonel William Casey, General John Adair is from there.
Oh, wow.
Mark Twain was actually conceived in my hometown.
Really?
He wasn't born there, but he was conceived. We know that.
Wow.
So it was a great
Tell me
place.
the name of the town again. Mark Twain was conceived.
Columbia, Kentucky, in Adair County. So named for General John Adair. And we grew up in a place where people knew each other. And therefore, when my brother and I became known as readers, people would just gift us books, college books, high school books. What was weird is I grew up not reading a lot of kids' books, although I did read a lot of children's books.
Right.
But these gifts were much more sophisticated than what one would usually get. That's just what people had. And so this family friend worked at Lindsey Wilson, and the library was getting rid of one of their old set of encyclopedias. They were getting a new set of encyclopedias. This is why I started smirking when you brought up the encyclopedia.
Yeah, I knew you would appreciate that. I don't know why I knew that, but I knew.
We're gifted a 1975 set of Encyclopedia Britannica.
Oh, yeah.
Along with the matching books of the year from like 1962 all the way to like 1981. And my brother and I would read these.
There's like, what, 26? There's a couple dozen volumes at least, right?
Yeah, no, it was my first bookshelf that I ever owned.
That's cool.
Was to put all these in.
Were you proud of that?
I was.
Yeah.
And it didn't dawn on me, till later in my life that, this was an interesting gift that someone gave to invest in us. And that was the encyclopedias I used all the way until I went to college.
Well, yeah. It's interesting. I mean, how old were you? What's your earliest memory of people giving you books? Like how old do you think?
6, 7.
That's pretty young.
Pretty young. My mother cleaned houses in town. And so they knew we liked stuff. And so they would gift us books all the time. We were in the library a lot. So during the summers, if we weren't on the farm and my mother was going into town to clean houses, and my father was working at the factory at that time,
Okay.
and would farm kind of in the evenings. But we would go into town with my mother, and she would drop us off at the library, and we would stay at the library for 6 hours, 6, 7 hours.
Public library, right?
Public library,
Yeah.
Dare County Public Library, the Janice Holt Giles Memorial Library, because the great Kentucky writer Janice Holt Giles, also from my hometown.
Is it still there? Is
That library is still there,
still there?
and they just added a new expansion for the Adair County Genealogy Society, which I have done a lot of work with when I was living there, because I was just in the library all day. And my brother and I are quiet and bookish, and so they thought it was fun. And we would always start with the morning paper because we'd gotten into the habit of, except now we were not a week delayed. We could actually read 2 days, Louisville Courier Journal.
You were current.
Yeah. And they just thought it was funny on the one hand,
Yeah.
but then they invested in us. And so I started listening to Berlitz foreign language records that they had at the library, and they had the phonograph there, and I put on my headphones and start in the corner muttering Italian or German or whatever record I would take that week. And then they would kind of give me challenges. They would say, well, could you get through all the Berlitz records for Italian? Of course, it was kind of like Traveler's Italian, but I would do it, because of my competitive nature.
Do you remember how to spell Berlitz? How do you spell that?
Berlitz.
Okay, got it right.
At the time, it was the very famous set of records that teach you, oh, you're going to take a trip to Italy. So all the sentences are things like, where's the train station, stuff like that. I didn't learn any kind of grammatical things. It was all rote language learning. And that was the birth of my love of foreign languages that led me to want to be a high school teacher. I was going to teach Spanish and French in high schools. And
it was in the library listening to records.
Yeah.
And these are records, right?
Records.
Yeah.
And then the next thing you know, you're checking those records out and taking them home. Next thing you know, you're
checking them out. Yes.
Checking things out of the library.
Well,
records out of the library.
It is kind of an awkward thing to carry home, I guess. Yeah. You don't want to scratch them.
Oh yeah.
Or drop them. They're not as sturdy as books. They're not as heavy.
But to be fair, vinyl is making a comeback.
Yes, it is.
And so
I think I have a Berlitz. I think I have the Hebrew one.
Oh, good.
I have a Hebrew one. I don't know if it's Berlitz. I'll have to look.
There was a Hebrew one, and I listened to some of it. And then I started looking at the foreign language books they had at the library. And then next thing you know, I'm at home, and anytime we had little allowance money, or my grandfather would give me like $5 or something, we'd go and we'd buy paper, pens, Post-it notes. And my dad comes home from work, and I have put Post-it notes on every object of the house with its Spanish equivalent, trying to learn all these Spanish words.
The folks that are giving you these books, were they Black people only?
No.
Or was it anybody?
Anybody who interact. Now, to be fair, I grew up in a world where Black people and white people had to interact with each other. There was no way to separate those worlds.
Okay.
And so
what I'm noticing,
you had Black people giving you things, you had white people giving you things.
Okay. Gotcha. Okay. So it seems like you're in a situation where you're young, and what I'm noticing is you had confidence, because I don't know about you, but I don't know if I would want to give a book to somebody if I didn't have confidence in them. And for that, it requires them to have some confidence in themselves so that they will use it, right? Mm-hmm. And so I'm noticing you're listening to these records, you're developing a love of language. There must have been some kind of experience that you're having that was obvious to other people, that you feel like you have some confidence to be able to learn these languages. So it's not like, or was it just, would you describe it that way, or would you just say it was enjoyable for you? But then the enjoyment had to have some
Yeah,
kind of
I would say enjoyment is probably the best word
enjoyment?
for it.
Okay.
And then people just invested in it.
So you,
Uh,
well, you obviously, if you're looking at these books, I mean, a lot of people would be scared of the books. They would look at the encyclopedia and it would just look like too much, you know. Especially if it's you know, my dad was a my dad worked with his hands, and he was high school graduate. He did read, but I wouldn't say that he was. I mean, we had lots of books in our home. It wasn't, we were definitely not anti-intellectual or anti-book, but I wouldn't describe him as someone as a reader. Those are not my typical memories of my dad. Um, and I always loved books as a kid, but I think I had a confidence, like I felt like I could understand it. They were useful to me. They
mhm,
were useful to me, and I remember that from a young age. So
yeah,
you must have connected with the modality of that. Must have had a connection, and if you're having enjoyment, and then obviously people can see you enjoy this
yeah.
5 or 6 hours at the public library, and you were active the whole time. It's not like you and your brother were like trying to figure out something else to do.
No, I mean and of course it was a small library compared to libraries I'm now familiar with, but you know,
Yeah.
there was just so many things in it. And I remember becoming obsessed with the USSR because you hear about it on the news at that time. And so
Interesting.
there's this great book in the library, one of my favorite books when I was a kid. And it had to be because I still remember this book and I always bring it up. The Kodak company had gone to USSR through a variety of places throughout the old republic and had given people cameras, and they would give them the pictures in exchange of keeping a set of the pictures. There's your old timey thing back when you had to take your pictures and get them developed. But these pictures from another place on the planet, and I had still never left Kentucky by that point of my life. And to be reading books about people on the other side of the world and what are they eating for, dinner. Some of these pictures had food in them. These are pictures of, family, how are they dressed?
Mhm.
What are these kinds of things? And so I was just always fascinated with that bigger world. And sometimes you see about it on television. And then as soon as I'd say, where is blank place? My parents would say, well, look it up in the encyclopedia. And now it's, oh, look at these names. And how would you pronounce those names? And then next time at the library, you're asking the librarian, how would one, pronounce these names? And then that's how you get introduced to other things. Also,
I love that. Look it up in the encyclopedia,
just look it up.
which means it's very different than Google.
True.
It's very different in Google because when you look it up in the encyclopedia, first of all, you have the object in your hands and you can feel the weight of the work.
Yeah.
And then to get to it, you have to pass a bunch of other stuff.
Yeah. It's
Remember?
just like the shelves, the
Yeah.
stacks of a library.
Yeah, you don't have to do that with Google typically. I mean, well,
Correct.
I mean, there's typically stuff, but it's just a very different experience. And then you're saying talking to the librarian. You had to talk to the librarian. What?
Mhm.
You had to ask them, like another person that was older than you,
Yeah.
how is it that this word is said, or how do you spell it?
Right.
So that's now, Brad, how does this all connect with did your brother become a professor?
He did not. He is a probate attorney in Atlanta.
Oh,
He went to graduate school for U.S. history, did not like the academy. Decided he didn't want to be a professor. And so he didn't finish. So he got a master's,
okay.
kind of en passant, as we would say, on his way to a doctorate, but he never finished his doctorate. He was really interested in American pop culture.
Oh, Pop culture meaning like
Yeah,
movies,
music mostly. And he
music?
still actually runs a podcast on music.
No
Uh,
kidding. What's the name
yeah,
of the podcast?
it's called Get On Down with the Stepfather of Soul.
That's a long name for a podcast. Hold on. Say it
Yes,
again. Get on
Get
what?
On Down with the Stepfather of Soul.
With the stepfather of soul. Wow.
Yeah, Stepfather of
Yes.
Soul is the name I gave him. We were teenagers, and he was really into James Brown and trying to dance like James Brown.
Is he
And
older
so
than you?
he's 2 years older than me.
Okay.
And so I jokingly call him the stepfather of soul instead of the godfather of soul, which was James Brown's title.
Okay.
And he's used that now as his kind of moniker. But we were
How long
both,
how long has he done that podcast?
oh, years, 15 some years.
Wow.
Back in the early podcasting, back when people would do things and play it on Real Player.
Oh yeah.
Back in the old
Well, back when it
system.
was on an Apple iPod.
Even before that, just you
What?
have to get on the World Wide Web.
I thought that's how it got. Okay.
I
thought
had
that's how it got
actually
its name.
started doing some of that stuff before him because I did college radio. And then
Really?
when I went to
know that.
Spain as a Fulbright scholar, I started doing a little podcast on Real Player. You know, low quality audio recordings in the early days of the internet. And then he started one, and then I stopped doing mine. So he's definitely had more hours logged compared to me.
Okay.
But
Is it commentary on soul?
for him, no, it's just music. So he
It's just
finds
music,
obscure
really?
soul from different regions. One of his interests, and I think one of his theses, was on how Soul Train created kind of a national Black music. Kind of prior to that, so like early 70s, late 60s, early 70s. Prior to that, every major Black city, so Philadelphia, Atlanta, Chicago, Memphis, had their own sounds. And so you can immediately listen and tell which city that music came from.
Wow. From the sound.
Yeah. Soul Train brought all those acts together onto a national syndicated television program. And so then you begin something like a Black culture that becomes kind of homogenous in terms of music, but even culture. So now when people say Black, they're more likely going to think urban than rural. But there used to be a big difference between urban Black and country Black, as we would say. And so this kind of creation of a national Black culture coming out of the 70s is something he's fascinated. So his podcast focuses on kind of that pre-homogenization. So here's, like a week, we're going to celebrate, Philadelphia sound. And here are artists that no one remembers who were big in the Philadelphia scene at the time.
Where does he find them? Where does he find these pieces?
He when he was in grad school, he started doing actual record swaps where people would mail each other records. This is still all before Napster, before
that is really old school.
Online music. And so,
through the mail.
Yeah, he's also a game show historian. My brother and I both love game shows.
Wow.
And he would actually trade game show tapes where people would be like, oh, here's a old copy of a 1972 episode of Password. And, in exchange, I'll give you the pilot to The Price is Right. And, they'll trade tapes.
Wow.
Back when
there's that's the historian in him right there.
Yes. But to be
that's
fair,
a very
that
historian
was
thing.
Fandom back then.
Sure. That makes sense.
So now people claim to be
I guess
fans.
fandom is kind of a historical thing.
Yeah. And now
archiving.
People can be lazy because it's all on YouTube now anyway.
But, is it? It's all on YouTube now?
Stuff like that is. I don't hear people saying, I'm trading tapes.
No.
In the same way.
Oh, that's interesting.
But, we used to do this even in libraries, the interlibrary loan, where, this library would send that library a copy of a book they had. And you'd have to request from the librarian, could you find a library that has this and procure, books?
You and your brother seem to have a relationship where you spur each other on.
Oh yeah.
So that's nice because when you go to the library and you have somebody else there that
Mhm.
you can show something to and talk about it. And it's not just you that witnessed it, it's somebody else.
True.
And then that person is going home with you and you can talk about it. Does that, do you
Yeah,
think that that just kind of made it accelerate
it
the love
did.
of books?
You know,
Did you get
both
along with your
positive
brother?
and negative. We got along. We kind of had to.
Yeah.
We had each other, and we
Do you
had a lot of.
remind him of that? We had to get along.
That's a part of that.
Okay.
Both of us were academically strong, and that was what we were known for.
Yeah.
And so there was a kind of competitiveness in
Yeah.
it
Okay.
that wasn't always fun. You know,
For
there's
you or for him?
for both of us.
Really?
There's hilarious.
I think it's
cassette
usually
tapes.
the younger brother that has that.
No, hilariously, my brother and I still wish we had these cassette tapes we used to make. So my grandfather had bought a tape recorder in like 1981, and my brother and I would go to the store with the little money we'd scrounged up and would buy blank cassette tapes. And we would just put it in the cassette recorder and we would try to download kind of everything in our imaginations onto these cassette tapes. We would create little shows and skits, and
That's fun.
sometimes it's just reading books onto the tape.
Right.
And trying to imitate James Earl Jones.
Ooh.
If you
Wait,
remember,
what was James Earl Jones in that? Was
James
it
Earl Jones, he
was
had
it
just come out
the
he
Hunt
was
for Red
Darth Vader,
October? Oh yes,
in
of
Star Wars,
course,
the
of
voice of
course.
Vader.
Yeah, the real Star Wars. Yeah,
Yes, the real ones.
the real.
And he had just become big at that time. He had read the Bible onto tape, and people could buy, like 60 cassette tapes total of James Earl Jones reading the Bible. And
Wow.
so we heard some of those tapes because my aunt had bought them, and we were listening to that. And so, we all want to talk, with that super booming bass voice when you're 8, 9 years old.
Uh-huh.
And so we'd
Wow.
just do tapes of all kinds of stuff. And the things we were reading gave us the ideas. And so even though we really didn't know what was happening in other parts of the world, we'd make up skits about being in other parts of the world. And so our imaginations
Yeah.
grew because we were interested in the fact that there was a greater world out there, not as an escape, but as a complement to our very life we live. And that part has followed me. And I try to use that in my teaching with students to show them that there's a world out there, a world that works very differently than the one they're used to, that's equally human, equally blessed, equally dealing with similar problems. And once you realize that, you gain a perspective that makes you not overly dwell on the particularities of any particular situation, but then to say, and this sounds really weird now, I'm about to say it out loud, how this is an episode in the general human drama. And when I teach Bible study at my church, I'm always bringing that up, particularly when we're reading like Old Testament documents like Genesis. Oh no, this is every story you've ever heard. Stories of lying and deceit and murder, but also of love and of tenderness.
Were you biblically literate? You mentioned James Earl Jones reading the Bible. Did you grow up
in a
biblically
very
literate?
religious household? Yes,
Okay.
very religious line of preachers. So Christian Baptist.
Christian Baptist.
And then when I went to college, so we were, I went to Sunday school every Sunday of my life.
What version of the Bible was read?
Oh, the King James Bible, of course.
King James.
When I got to college, and my
I was raised on the King James as well.
My Bible professor wonderfully would say, "Oh, you read the old King Jim," and then she insisted that I get a copy of the Oxford English Bible.
Oh.
And that was, it has footnotes and
The
all this stuff. And that was our textbook Bible.
This is resting on the Oxford English Bible.
English
This microphone.
Bible, yes.
But I have I have the Schofield King James up there,
Okay,
right up there.
yeah.
Well, the
And so,
Schofield has footnotes too.
oh yeah. So when I went to Georgetown College, every student had not only religion requirements, Bible requirements. And so
Were
actually
those enjoyed? Those courses enjoyed?
I enjoyed them. I don't know if everybody did, but I did. And it really opened the Bible to me, not just as a book of my faith and religion,
Right.
but as, dare I say, a piece of great literature.
Mhm.
And I had great Bible professors who allowed the Bible to illuminate life, not just in our how do we please God, but here's the trope in all of Western civilization that follows from this idea. And then you realize, oh, and then my own interest in the Bible, every time I become interested in it, I read all the books I can find on it. And just the history of the Bible, and people were executed for translating the Bible. And you start beginning to realize, this book is precious and valuable.
Yeah.
And so that was part of my
Well, so
formation.
when you got to Georgetown, you were already pretty familiar with the
Yes,
Bible, so it wasn't and in the King James too, which I
right,
think is one of the more artistic,
yeah,
like Psalm 23 in the King James.
correct.
I don't I can't think of that psalm in any other translation. It's
No,
burned in my memory forever, just like, Amazing Grace.
yeah, it's kind of like
Did
when
you
people
read, did
want
you
to.
sing hymns?
Oh yes, tons of
Some
hymns. And of
hymns?
course, I grew up in the Black church, so tons of music, tons of good preaching.
There were no white people in your church?
Not in the one I was at. There
Okay.
were white people who attended sometimes the church my mother grew up in. Now, of course, this is deep segregated South. I shouldn't say deep South because people in Tennessee will get mad. No one in Tennessee thinks that Kentucky's Southern. And so
Just look at a map.
you had the remnants of old slave
Yeah,
life. So
right,
as
right.
Black people
Definitely
became
rural.
freed,
Yeah.
they did seek membership in these white churches that they were attending as slaves, but then were not granted membership as free people.
So
And
you grew up
so,
in a Black church. That's how you describe it?
yeah, I just call it the Black church
Okay.
because, there's
And
a certain
it's
way in which
because white people didn't want to go there, is what you're saying?
some of it, and they definitely
Okay.
didn't want Black people at their church.
Gotcha.
As King comments, Sunday 10 a.m., the most segregated hour in America.
I've heard that. Yeah.
And it's unfortunate.
Mhm.
One of the nice things about being in Los Angeles is you can be in these multiracial, multicultural churches.
Is that your
Where
experience in LA now?
that's dare I say, one of the biggest positives of being in LA.
Are you still Baptist?
No, not really.
How did that
Well, I joke.
transition
I'm an
change?
Episcopalian by marriage.
Okay.
My wife grew up Episcopalian. When I was doing graduate work in Memphis, Tennessee, I became aware of the congregational tradition that goes all the way back to the Pilgrims and Puritans. And so I call myself a Baptist Congregationalist Episcopalian. So I'm not a member of the Episcopal Church. I never joined the Episcopal Church. I've never been received or confirmed in that sense. I joke, my confirmation is the Holy Ghost baptisms, completely thrown underwater by Baptist preachers.
And held there for how long?
For enough time for
couple seconds.
drinking the water in the baptismal font.
That's how long, really? Wow.
Yeah, and I don't know how to swim.
Full
So
immersion.
I was just drowning.
Full immersion, right? Full
Yes.
immersion. Yeah.
Full immersion doesn't count. You have to be all the way under.
Now, do you still read the King James version in church, or have they gone to the Oxford?
No, the church I go to usually use Revised Standard version, New Revised Standard. I still read King James some and the Oxford English Bible just because that's my academic kind of Bible, and I like the King James just for its historical sounds and values. But for me, when I took New Testament Greek in college, because I was fascinated with the idea of learning Greek. And
how many languages did you take in college? And we haven't gotten to Spain yet, but Spanish,
French, German.
Wow.
New Testament Greek were the four I took in college.
Did you take Latin in high school? You mentioned your dad.
I did not.
Okay.
By the time I got to high school, we only had Spanish and French.
How did your dad do in Latin? I don't think you ever answered that.
Oh, well, according to his report card, he made C plus in Latin, which is a mighty darn
Before
good grade back then.
before grade inflation.
Yeah.
We haven't even gotten to grade inflation yet.
Yeah.
What do you think
but-
about that? Yeah. Okay. So you're taking New Testament Greek. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh, no. But what I loved about the idea was that you could really tap into the history of the Bible by looking at Greek and the evolution of language, and had a lot of theological value.
Oh yeah. Big time.
I regret that I've never taken a course in biblical Hebrew. It's still on the list. But reading the Bible in Greek helped me connect it to Greek culture as well.
Mhm.
And of course, when I started studying philosophy along with that and realizing, oh, Paul just said that faith is the hypostasis. Wait a bit, Plato uses that word. Oh, wait. The substance, the literal reality of things. I keep saying someday I'm going to write a book for churches, something called church philosophy.
Mhm.
Just here are these moments in the Bible, or beginning of the Gospel of John, and beginning was the Logos. What is that?
Right.
All these philosophical words pop up in the Bible.
Brad, when I don't know if you ever said what your major was
Oh,
in
sorry.
college. Did you?
In
Were you a
college?
philosophy major?
I wound up a philosophy major.
Oh.
I kept my other plan. I created my own major in college because I went to a school that allowed you to do that, called Modern Language Studies.
Okay.
Now you can actually find that in universities, but at the time,
You were a pioneer.
yeah, where it was just, I'm going to take 60 credits of languages. And so I had a primary, a secondary, and a tertiary language in that requirement.
Your
so
primary
Spanish
was
the primary.
Spanish. Okay.
The secondary was German. The tertiary
Wow.
was French. And then I had what I called language elective space. And that's where my New Testament Greek classes went.
How did you end up a philosophy major? What in the world happened?
Yeah. Well, we had
I mean, you're a
required,
Baptist, you're you're King James,
yeah,
hymns, and
Yeah.
then you get to
Chuck
well,
College.
I mean the language thing makes sense, but
Yeah.
like what is it about philosophy that
Well, my first love of philosophy happened at Georgetown College. Took philosophy. Everyone had to take it. It was
Okay.
called basic philosophy, but technically it was philosophy of religion at
Oh.
Georgetown College because it's a Baptist college. And let's talk about religion as much as we can.
it
And so
sounds like something I would do.
and so the very first book I ever read in philosophy was Kelly James Clark's book, Return to Reason.
Oh yes, I have that book.
And
I know that book.
oh yeah, and I love that book. I've taught it at times in the sense, and I just tell students when I teach that book, I'm really over energetic. This was the book. And I am asking, how would I prove the existence of God?
Hmm.
And I'd grown up in a Baptist church that had always said, there's no use to even think that way or talk that way. And here's my Baptist professors
Mhm.
thinking and talking that way. And one of my professors, when I confided in him this tension, he said, you can be a Baptist and not leave your brain at the door. And
What a concept.
I had
Was
Robert
that the first
Kushner's-
time you felt that way, or
It was
first
one of
time
the
you
first
heard
times I
that?
felt that way.
What up to that point? I mean, you obviously have been thinking a lot.
Oh yeah.
What I mean, had you felt like you had a adversarial relationship with your faith up until
I didn't
that
have an
point?
adversarial one. I just held them separate from each other.
Okay.
I thought, okay,
Separate,
I'm just
separate
brilliant
but
person.
equal.
In a certain way.
What
You know,
was
kind
it? What was it about the separation though? I don't
Well, it was-
understand.
Well, you're a very brilliant person, very intellectually motivated. That won't save your soul at all. And no amount of your intelligence saves your soul.
Okay.
Right. And so, as the old hymn would go, as long as I got King Jesus, I don't need nobody else. But
Yeah, but that's you that in my context growing up that way, I went to an integrated church in Denver.
yeah.
That was an anti-intellectual
Mhm.
sentiment, I'm sad to say.
Oh yeah.
Because that was just a reason not to think about things, usually.
Oh,
for,
yeah.
I mean, they're thinkers there. In the Myers-Briggs, you swing a dead cat, you're going to hit the thinkers. But I feel like, I think some people even lost their faith because of it coming out
No,
of
I
that
suspect that
experience.
did happen. But for me, I actually realized those two things could go together, and
Okay.
philosophy was where I could do it.
Did you
And
have
I
any
was
discussions with your parents about that, or your
not
grandparents?
really, because I was from that generation where as long as you went, if you went to college, you
Mhm.
were going to be pretty well set for your life. And
Okay.
so they didn't really care what I majored
Oh, really? Okay, cool.
in. Yeah. They'd never been to college. They didn't know how colleges worked or operated. I'm what we'd now call first gen student.
That's a very pure way of looking at it then.
Yeah.
And
So
maybe that
just
comes
college to
filters
learn.
down into your way of the pure way of looking at the academy, as you call it, instead of the
Yeah,
industry of higher education.
correct. And so I tell students even today, I'm not going to persuade you to major in one thing instead of another. Find where your passions are, find what you're good at.
Mhm.
If you get a bad grade from me, I'm secretly telling you you might not be good at this, but there might be that other course where you're
Right.
really doing good. And that was me in philosophy,
Okay.
where I'm taking the course and realizing, oh, I'm getting A's in philosophy and B's in history. And then I realized,
Wow.
oh, I'm better at philosophy than I am at
Oh,
history.
okay.
And I went to a
Interesting.
school, you're talking about grade inflation. I went to a school that had no pluses or minuses. So the second you didn't have an A, you had a B. The second you didn't have a B, you had a C. It's that kind of place.
Uh-huh.
And so I realized, oh, I'm getting A's in philosophy. So after basic philosophy, I took logic, I took
Ooh.
existentialism,
Ooh.
and my existentialism professor was the great Ruth Heiser, really well-known kind of Kentucky Baptist thinker. She had done a lot of stuff even with the Kentucky Baptist Convention, had been a missionary for a while, got her doctorate at Indiana University, did her undergraduate, I think, at Baylor, back when Baylor's philosophy department was known as like the Baptist philosophy center, since it's really become actually Catholic. It's kind of funny. So I have colleagues here who wonder, gee, there's all these evangelicals in the philosophy department. And then at Baylor, he's dead now, but Stuart Rosenbaum one time was trying to recruit
Oh,
me to
yeah.
Baylor, saying, we
I
need
remember
more
him.
young Baptist scholars coming to Baylor because there's all these non-Baptists at Baylor. I'm like, it seems like the two programs just need to switch their philosophy departments. But Ruth
Now,
Heiser,
yeah, well, I'm sorry, I have to bring this up. I
yeah,
don't have to, but you mentioned Rosenbaum, and I just happen to know that name. Now, were these Democrats, you think? These Baptists
I don't know.
At Baylor,
That I don't
at
know. I don't
Georgetown?
know Baylor well enough to make the judgments.
Did you ever make these connections between religion and politics at all?
Not really, because I grew up
They didn't talk about it in class or
not in
make
class.
comments?
No,
Okay, no.
in
They didn't have
Kentucky.
like a picture of Ronald Reagan with a knife through his head or
No,
anything
no,
like that.
no,
Nothing like that. Okay.
no, no. To be fair, I grew up in a world that, at least in Adair County, Kentucky, was both Democrat and Republican. And of course, Kentucky is one of those weird states. It tends to lean Republican for presidential elections and Democrat for governors.
Yeah.
Now, to be fair, this is an old notion of Democrat.
Yes.
But sometimes it's called Dixiecrat.
Okay.
So Southern Democrats, and then you had
Yeah.
Republicans, Lincoln lovers, as
Mhm.
some Democrats would call them back then. And so I
Now
grew up in a very different political climate.
well, I'm just trying to think of you mentioned you took logic and you took existentialism, and you seem to have a special appreciation for the lady that taught you existentialism.
Yes.
And I'm just trying to think of, the first thing I'm thinking of is a Baptist that is interested in existentialism. She doing did she have an apologetic concern, or did she have
She was mostly, I mean, we did Kierkegaard, we did like 1 week of Nietzsche, we then did some Heidegger, we did a nice amount of Paul Tillich.
Oh,
You
okay.
know, so it was definitely like a Christian existentialism.
Mhm. Okay.
And
Gotcha.
so my
Was it
existentialism is also Christian
theological
existentialism.
liberalism, would you say? Was it, would you use the term liberal? The term liberal in theology doesn't have the same exact
Yeah.
connotation, but were you cognizant of you're getting a liberal theological bent in this, or was
Not to my knowledge.
okay?
I knew it was not fundamentalist, right?
No,
Because I
definitely.
grew up with
Paul
that.
Tillich is definitely not
Yeah.
fundamental.
So for me, it was just, oh, I didn't think there was a tension, you know, like between being Baptist and intelligent at Georgetown College. I began to realize, oh, there's a whole way to divide Baptist into those who are interested in these kind of
Yeah,
intellectual questions
that's
and
a
the ones
pretty
who are
big
not.
thought. That's a pretty big thought to have.
And so I grew up at Georgetown College knowing, oh, you can be a brilliant young Baptist scholar.
Cool.
And so then I never had any worries about it after that. And so, I mean, Baptist still forms, I would say, like 75% of my theology. And the 25% it doesn't. It's just Baptist had nothing to say about that. But
were you working on why didn't you major in theology?
that is probably more of the crisis of faith story. When I was in college, I had yearnings for ministry and going to seminary. So actually, when I applied for graduate programs, I also applied for seminaries. I knew by the faculty I spoke to that philosophy would equally work. So I just didn't major in religion at Georgetown College, even though I had enough classes and enough friends
religion.
in it.
Yeah. Okay.
And what have you. And so I didn't major in that just because I didn't think it was what I was interested in.
When did you have the thought, I'm going to get a PhD in philosophy? Was it at Georgetown?
It was at Georgetown College. Because I had to get a PhD if I ever wanted to live that professor's life.
What, I want to say what grade you were, what level were you?
It's like sophomore year.
Wow, that's pretty early to have that thought.
Yeah. And at
Was it
Georgetown
after
College,
logic? Was it after existentialism?
it was kind of along with it. But my decision to be a college professor didn't automatically entail a decision to be a philosophy professor.
Okay.
So when I applied for grad schools, I applied to seminary, I applied to Ph.D. programs in philosophy, and I applied for graduate programs in languages, particularly Spanish. So I could have equally become a Spanish professor. But I knew I wanted to be a professor.
Oh.
And upon people at Georgetown finding that out about me, they recruited me into the honors program. Now, at Georgetown College, honors is only junior and senior year. So you have to have kind of proven your mettle during your first 2 years. And so I got into that and decided, oh, well, I'll try to blend my love of Spanish and philosophy. Started working on the Spanish philosopher Miguel de Unamuno. And that got me the Fulbright to study more of Unamuno in Salamanca.
How do you spell his name?
Unamuno.
Okay.
Unamuno.
What was it like studying in Spain? Did you say University of Salamanca?
Yeah, University of Salamanca, the fourth oldest university in Europe.
Really?
It was a treat. It was such a real treat. Spain is.
What are the first three? Is it Cambridge, Oxford, and Sorbonne?
Well, Paris is one. I think Bologna is either one or two. I can't remember if it's before Paris or after, but definitely they're the two oldest, Paris, Bologna. Third is Oxford, fourth is Salamanca. Salamanca before Cambridge. And
was it a Catholic school?
It started as one, it then became secularized.
Okay.
And then the Catholic Church created a second university in Salamanca called the Pontificate. And so the Pontifical University of Salamanca is also in Salamanca. And so I got to enjoy both of those.
What's that town
their
like?
Libraries. And
it looks really pretty. I mean, I've seen pictures
Salamanca
of it.
is a beautiful city up in the northwest part of Spain, right kind of south of Basque Country.
Yeah, I was gonna say if it's northwest, it's in the mountains.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so
Did you meet any Basque people when you were there?
not really. It was a tense time at the time between Spain and Basque Country. And of course, about a year after I left was the big Atocha bombing of the ETA. And so I've met more Basque people in California because there's this big Basque community in Bakersfield.
Oh, I didn't know that.
I've actually met more Basque people in Bakersfield, California than I met when I was in Spain, even though Unamuno is a Basque philosopher.
Oh,
He
I
was
didn't know
born in the
that.
Basque country.
Really?
And one of my favorite current Spanish philosophers, Javier Zubiri, was also Basque. So there's some kind of connection I have with Basque culture, I guess. But Salamanca was nice because people in Spain in general are very well educated, even if they don't go to college. And
They like books.
they love books. And in fact, the street I lived on in Salamanca was called Bookseller Street.
Oh, that's cool.
And people read the newspaper. They read multiple newspapers. Everyone had an opinion about something. You could go to the bar and people would be discussing politics, discussing, theology, philosophy. And it really opened my eyes to a world where, of course, it's a little university, town. It's always been since medieval times. But it was just nice to kind of be, it's such a center of thinking. It's kind of like one of my professors at Georgetown talked about visiting Oxford once and says, you enter into Oxford and you immediately just feel your IQ go up a couple of points. Salamanca was a lot like that.
Was it
It
cold?
also showed me that I was very American.
You were
Because
very American.
It was my first time outside of the country. So
this a surprise to you?
it was
Really?
in a
Wow.
certain way.
Okay. Now, why do you say that? Why do you say you discovered you were American?
Well, just in the sense of until you are outside the United States, you don't realize how American certain things are. So one of my favorite examples is I sat in on a Merleau-Ponty class at the University of Salamanca, grad level class.
So it's not that you had a baseball cap on and you had some
No.
you dipped
Well,
in
I have a similar case of that.
and you were like,
I did have one moment of that. So I was at a pub with some of my colleagues from University of Salamanca. And every Thursday night, because there are no classes on Friday there, every college student kind of goes out and stays up all night, going to pub to pub to pub to pub. And there's actually a Spanish slang verb, which really just means to Thursday.
when do they go to bed?
Oh, well, Spaniards only go to bed like between 4 a.m. and 8 a.m. because they're going to sleep in the afternoon during siesta anyway. And so you have these late dinners.
Sounds really tiring.
You go out, and someone immediately detected I was wearing a class ring. And
from your high school?
No, from my college. I had a high school ring, but when I got my degree at Georgetown College, I bought a college ring for my kind of graduation gift. And of course, they had never seen such a thing. And so that was one of those moments where I then stopped wearing it out in Spain because it was just, why are you wearing this thing?
Yeah.
Oh, a ring that said you went to school?
That's hilarious.
So they did find that weird. But
That's hilarious.
Other times it was just.
Did you keep that schedule? Did you keep that Spanish schedule? Did it interfere with your schoolwork?
No, because schoolwork is set up in that schedule.
Oh my goodness.
It's a Spanish way of life.
Well, what do you have for breakfast? Tell me, when do you get up?
Breakfast in Spain. So you might have like a croissant, some coffee, of course.
Okay.
The Spanish joke would be to say
you
had coffee, cigarettes for breakfast. And then for your kind of mid-morning snack, you'd have like a croissant, some more coffee.
So these guys aren't going to 24-hour fitness, or they're not working out.
To be fair, they don't need to. They walk everywhere.
Okay.
They're
not doing Jane Fonda tapes.
Food. Yeah.
What do you have for lunch?
Lunch is the big meal in Spain. So you'd usually have 3 courses for lunch. And so first
Three?
it's usually some kind of salad of some kind, but like hearty salad, like, like a salad niçoise in France, kind of Spanish things. So you'd have like a salad with tuna fish on it,
Ooh,
and of course a
good.
good crusty piece of bread.
mm.
Then you would have a more standard
With butter?
second plate. No, the Spaniards didn't use a lot of butter with their bread. You had a lot of olive oil
Ooh,
with your bread.
okay. There's
Mediterranean
something, in other
cultures.
words, it's not dry.
Yeah.
Okay.
Then you'd have some meat with vegetable kind of thing second, and then a dessert for lunch, and of course
Is the dessert right after the
Yes.
food?
yes, and then
We'll be able to
but then
handle
you go home for 2 hours.
that. Okay.
Right? You have the siesta.
Oh, you rest right after. You don't go do
Yes.
the hardest work of your day.
Right. Then you go back to work
rest.
from 5 to 8,
Oh, interesting.
and then at 8 you're done.
What time is lunch?
Lunch is like 2 p.m. and dinner is like 9 p.m.
Oh, wow.
So usually around 5, right before you go back in for classes or work or anything, you'd have what's called merienda. You'd have some kind of pastry, or something, just to tide you over.
Mhm. What's for dinner?
Dinner depends on whether you're at home or going out. If you're at home, it's usually going to be a soup, some bread, cheese. If you're out, you're going to different pubs. Spaniards never stay at one place very long. And so you go to different pubs, you get like one caña, which is this kind of thin glass of beer, and you'd get some food item, which we'd call a tapa.
Okay.
And then you just go to like 5 of those places, and each place kind of had different things. And so
Is this very expensive? How expensive is
not
this
very
going?
expensive at all. So this is
Yeah.
prior to the euro. So right, conversions are going to be really weird. Let's say it'd be like $1 to get a glass of beer.
Wow.
But that came with a food item for free. It might be a little bowl of chips or peanuts or
That's
some
a
ham
really
on
good value.
toast.
Wait, are you is this $1 in current terms or back
$1
then?
American
Back then.
back then?
Okay.
Yeah. $1 back then would buy you that.
So this is like what?
But you'd go to like 6 different places.
$3 now? $2?
Yeah.
Something.
I mean, last time I was in Spain, all this has become expensive because
So 20
the euro has made everything expensive.
but back when you did it, it was like you could, for $20 you could spend
Have a
the
whole
night.
evening out, a whole evening, and have money left over.
Wow.
But
And now are people, they're not wasted after this. They're lubricated enough for pleasant conversation. How would you
Yeah.
put it? Okay.
well, real conversation. I mean, Spaniards have conversations, and so you go to the pub, and you're always with people. One word that I asked some of my colleagues at the time, what word would you use to describe Americans? And the word they picked was very interesting. It was solo. American life can be very solitary. In Spain, that doesn't exist. Even when you're dating someone, it's in a group setting, and whatnot. And people go, and you're expected to leave with your group. So you can't like abandon your group and run after anybody or anything like that.
I don't know if I interrupted you. It didn't mean to. When you were saying how you realized you were American,
Yeah.
were you one of these solo people?
Not really. I've always kind of been personable, and I
Okay.
love. I always joke I'm an inverted extrovert. I don't mind being by myself.
Yeah.
But I
you were
enjoy
not.
the company
You were
of
not in
others.
this way of them
No.
describing Americans. Okay.
No. And they found it weird that I wanted so much to be out and about because Americans aren't like that. But I guess what was neat was like you get the newspaper every morning, and American news is now in the international section.
Mm.
And you begin to realize, oh, I'm not front and center. I'm now an American, and now I have to represent America in a lot of ways.
Oh, I see.
That when I'm in America, between certain racist people I grew up with who would wonder what it would mean for you to be an American, let alone then to be in a country and be a representative of the United States, because Fulbright is technically a diplomacy grant, and then to say, I'm the representative of the United States. And then you realize, oh, you're so American.
Brad, I don't know if you realize, you probably do, but you just revealed that you love America.
Oh yeah, I always have that.
Well, that came right out right there.
Different from learning
When you said that you represent America.
Yeah.
That the only reason you'd have that thought is if you love America.
Well, you'd have to. I mean, this is why I think study abroad, when it's not done as tourism, is good. Okay. Right? Where you have to really realize.
Were you there for a full year?
I was there for a full year.
That's a good amount of time. Your Spanish must have,
and not in a program.
And you're speaking Spanish this whole time.
Just living there. Yes.
And your Spanish must have.
Yeah. You learn a lot of Spanish you didn't learn in school.
Wow.
Let's put it that way. But it's also just, and then I've traveled to other places since, but it's just like you begin to realize, oh, here's what it means to be American and how that interacts with other things. So you go, and I remember Columbine shootings happened while I was living in Spain. And the next morning, I'm in my office at the University of Salamanca, and my office mates are asking me 1,000 questions about America and about guns and things like that. And I explain growing up with guns. And I have to, of course, none of this is Spanish that you've been like taught to talk about, right? And so I'm explaining America's gun culture. And I want to make it intelligible to them. And you begin to realize, okay, I have to understand it in order to explain it to someone who's not from here. Yes. And then you realize, that's what that is.
Were they asking, were they interested in this as a matter of contempt, or was it curiosity?
It's curiosity.
That must have been easier for you to have a conversation if you didn't feel like you were constantly under some kind of contempt.
No. The contempt for Americans versus the curiosity for Americans, I think, is, at least outside the United States, a very recent phenomenon, would say, since the last 25 years or so.
Oh, okay.
It used to be anytime an American was anywhere on the planet, they would be objects of curiosity, not objects of disdain.
And is this a multiracial group that you're hanging out with in Spain?
It is.
Yeah.
And some of that's just because of the nature of Spanish Empire, but also the nature of Europe. And so you had people from all over. You have what my dissertation director calls the more pleasant old world racism. And so, Spaniards had no problem with
pleasant. Black, hold on, I gotta write that down. The more pleasant.
This is what my dissertation director called it. Old world racism.
Was he black?
No.
Dissertation director?
No.
Okay.
He was English.
Interesting.
And he talks about in context, he moved to Memphis to head this PhD program at the University of Memphis that I attended. And
he moved there from what part of England?
From Essex. He was at the University of Essex prior. And he jokes that he's moved to Memphis, and there's such racial tension in Memphis, given its role in the South and things.
Right.
And he found it weird because Memphis is a predominantly Scottish town.
I didn't know.
And there's all these Presbyterian churches everywhere. And he was like, am I supposed to give up my hatred of Scott to hate Black people in America? No, there's nothing wrong with Black people.
He hates Scots. He hates the Scots.
Yeah,
he did not.
He was landed gentry. His ancestors fought in wars about Scotland. And he found that funny. So he was like, no, I'll still hate the French.
It's interesting.
More than. And so when I was in Spain,
Winston Churchill in his history of the English-speaking peoples uses the term race early on in that to refer to the different groups of people that lived in those isles. And I
Yeah.
never realized how many different groups were bumping into each other over there.
Oh yeah.
Interesting.
And
Yeah.
so interestingly, me being an American
Right.
was more pleasant to them than if I were French.
And you're
Right.
talking about the dissertation advisor, not Spain.
Well, no, my own experience, like when I was
Okay.
in Spain,
Okay, I got you.
right? I was never treated differently for being, let's say, Black,
Right.
right? But had I been French, then the ribbing would have begun.
Huh.
And it reminds us that
What do they
different
not like about the
places do
French?
all this differently. Well,
Yeah,
the
right.
wars, the Carlist Wars in the 19th century between Spain and France.
I mean, people remember that. I mean, what
Cultural
impact does that have?
heritage, part of
Yeah.
the cultural heritage. I mean, why do the
Gotcha.
Hatfields hate McCoys at the Kentucky, West Virginia border? No one really knows anymore, but we're going to keep it up.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
It reminds us, as one philosopher of race wonderfully says, race does not travel. So, you go to Rwanda.
Race does not travel.
Yeah. So you go to like Rwanda and you can have a whole genocide with people that to us Americans look alike.
Yeah.
But they are sure that there's a difference between being Tutsi versus, I can't remember the other group all of a sudden. Hutus. Yeah. And they can swear they can spot the difference in a heartbeat. And I'm just like, I don't know.
Amazing.
And they're willing to go to genocide over it. Or you see the in Croatia and the whole break apart of the former Yugoslavia.
Yeah.
And so human difference and misunderstanding, I would say, ultimately, but to be willing to fight each other
We're going to
over
have
what I think are insignificant differences is a phenomenon of the world. It's always happened.
Yeah.
But it does not look the same everywhere.
We're going to have
I remind students that all the time because they want to somehow believe that the stories we're talking about in the United States is somehow a global conversation. No, it's a conversation inside American history. And the more you understand America, the better you understand it. But no one wants to understand America. And so they just, then the next thing you know, they've invented imaginary other countries that don't have similar problems or similar, situations.
Yeah. Brad, it sounds like you are a scholar and an educator, which brings up the question of why would you want to be associate dean? What is it about it? Is it the money? Did you need the money?
No. In fact,
I mean, it's a lot.
This is going to be
structured.
a scandalous sentence. This is a scandalous sentence. As I say in my class, it's a scandalous sentence. The scandalous sentence for today is I actually made less money this year than I made last year. And some of that has to do with how this job takes up a lot of time compared to having external things I used to do. Also, I'm a year-long contracted employee now at the university. So a lot of things that would give you extra summer money doesn't exist for me anymore. Not by a big difference, but I did make a little more without being in administration. That's different if I were higher up, to be fair. I became associate dean not really because I wanted to become it, but I felt like I needed to become it for a particular battle I was fighting in the university. And it was around graduate education. And I've been an advocate for years about our institution really investing in graduate education and not simply seeing it as a revenue process. So most universities see their graduate program as simply kind of revenue. It's judged by revenue. And I had ideas about doing it differently. And of course, when you speak up too much, you become the one who then has to do these things. And so I was brought in part to reimagine graduate education. So this was one of those, the dog that barks the loudest cases. I was just the dog that barked the loudest on the issue. And they said,
as a professor, you did?
Yes. And they're like, well, you've done as much as you can as professor on this issue. You would have to lead the movement. And I was given this opportunity. I said, okay, I'll do one term of it. If I don't get to address this concern,
yeah,
I'm going to quit. And as soon as it's done and graduate pieces have been put in play, I'll be done. And then I go back to faculty.
Can you do that? Now that you've been there for a while, can you fight?
Go back to faculty? Yes.
No, I mean, can you fight for the academy? Not the industry of higher education,
right.
The revenue source to pay all these lawyers that they have.
Yeah.
Pay all these administrators.
Yeah.
But what can you do?
Well, one of the projects I'm trying to do is reassert departmental governance of universities.
That's not happening.
Not really, not as much as it used to be. And it's because universities have become so regulated by federal and state processes. It's just easier to have an administrator do it. And this is that birth of the administration class that we see in higher education.
Yes.
Because, the professor's life I fell in love with was not chasing down lawsuits. And so you get the people who are willing to do that, and they become lifelong administrators.
Right.
And at least the school I went to, Georgetown College, the dean was a faculty member of Georgetown College.
He taught.
The president was a faculty member of Georgetown College.
He taught.
Yeah. And then after I left, a new person became dean and provost of Georgetown College, who was one of my journalism advisors when I worked for student newspaper. She taught my wife, Milton. She's now the president of Georgetown College, Rosemary Allen.
Your wife's name is Milton? Sorry, I just had to get
my
that
wife,
in
Milton. Yes, taught my wife, Milton.
She taught my wife, Milton.
Yes.
You know, Milton.
I know. The fun of a
sorry, I have to. I just. I got to get the pleasure in there sometimes.
Oh yes, the fun of the amphibole. So.
You always love a guest that knows exactly what
that the administration of Georgetown College came out of its faculty. You didn't have outsiders kind of coming in to administer. But what we're seeing in higher education now, most are people coming from outside institutions, then taking the first half of their time, learning the institution and getting to know people. Then they kind of move something around, and then they're off to their next job, the next gig.
Yeah.
I'm trying to model in this position, and I've been arguing with faculty colleagues. No, we should all be actually taking turns being associate dean. We should be taking turns being dean.
Ooh.
Right? We should have, because somewhere in higher education, one of the reasons it seems like an industry now is it's gotten away from its professorate. It's gotten away from its profession. And now with all the regulations and things, no sane faculty member would become an administrator, but then that has opened the door for the people who are willing to do that for the right price point to do it. And institutions now have cycles of new people at the top, disconnected from the long-term people who are teaching and working with students. And so I'm already on my fourth president, like my fifth or sixth provost. This is my...
You mean since you started?
Yeah, since I started in 2003.
Yeah,
fifth
okay.
Dean. And only one of those people out of all of that was a colleague I already had here at the university.
Was that Eng? Who was that? Michael Eng?
Michael Eng, yes. He was already...
I remember him. I remember him thinking he was a faculty guy.
Yeah.
But he was a priest, obviously.
He was also a
Jesuit priest. Yeah.
But the...
every time I saw him, I thought of him as a faculty. I thought of him as a professor.
Yeah, because he was.
Yeah.
And so the question becomes, how do we get back to that? A way of, how do we have administration
So part of this is as kind of training up the professorate
Mhm.
to have almost an expectation that this, it's not just that you're going to be chair, you're going to take your time being chair and, maybe graduate director somewhere,
Yeah,
but that you're going to go university wide at some
mhm,
point
yeah,
so that you can be baptized by fire in all of the nitty gritty details that people deal with in the administrative class. And you're bringing your wealth of institutional memory and what it's like to actually be on the front lines with the mission of the university, which is the students.
right.
Let's not forget that.
Yeah, yeah,
They're paying the bills, but they're also the reason for the institution to exist in the first place. What are we doing with that? It's not just about transcripts here, not just pushing up
true, true.
transcripts. So
But more importantly,
is that you want
do
to
that
add more
moment
important? Okay.
in
More important.
administrative, and then return to faculty life.
And then bring that experience and that new wisdom to how things operate.
Right.
Okay.
So one of the things that makes the administrative class problematic in higher education is people can make a mess and then leave the institution,
Ooh, that's not good.
right? And then they go to the next place and make a mess, and then they just jump from place to place.
And they get promoted.
The need for
Sounds like a
administrators is
politician,
growing.
actually. It sounds like a politician.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, if you look in the Chronicle of Higher Education, there are more jobs for administrators than for faculty right now. And so, people just jump from place to place. Oh, I want to be associate dean, to become provost, to become president. And that's the game they play. And I'm not interested in that.
It's like someone running for city council and then supervisor and then Congress and the Senate. Yeah.
And so
governor.
So I'm kind of an experiment, but I don't mind. I'm an experimentalist as a pragmatist. I'm trying to figure out whether it is actually still possible to be a faculty-centered faculty administrator.
Wow.
For a little period to accomplish a particular task.
Yeah.
And then we turn to my professorial life. That's a different strategy than most people in higher education administration today.
Yes.
So I'm here to try to solve a problem I experienced at the lower level, get up here, try to solve it, then go back down. Which is what I'd hope.
And you're not sure. Yeah. And you're not sure if this experiment is going to work. Like if you're going to actually be an inspiration to not only your philosophy colleagues, but also other faculty, other departments to do the same thing. Is that kind of what you're saying? You're not sure?
That would be highly experimental.
But the fact that you're a pragmatist, you said you're a pragmatist. Tell everybody what that means.
Well, pragmatism, of course, is an American philosophical tradition centered on the idea of democracy and experience. And so part of the beauty of the early America was the wild wilderness, right, that allowed us to invent all kinds of things. And so pragmatism seeks that spirit. And so at the core is this idea of experimentalism, that we try things, we see how they work intellectually, not merely just practically, in the general sense of the word pragmatism, but in the sense of intellectually. And then if that doesn't work, try something new. That science models for us that technique of experimentation, verification, falsification. And so I see my time in this position as an experiment of that sort. Not just will it actually produce practically these consequences, but can higher education itself actually have such administrators now? Or has it become too corporate, too regulated, so that universities do things even if none of the faculty want it or not, because there's some law out there or some regulation? Could we actually determine the future of the university?
And are you still agnostic about that? Or are you leaning one way or the other? Okay.
A little. I have the ability to pull it off. But I think people will say in that case, oh, that's just Brad. He's already quirky. And look at him. He's just an old timey guy.
He's got his old values from the
Yeah. So they're willing to put up with
rural
it.
world. Okay.
But would,
He likes guns.
yeah, could that be in higher education?
Okay.
Right. I've seen people, I'm not talking about anyone current, but we had a interim dean once who I knew was part of our faculty. We had fought similar battles with each other on the same side. As interim dean, made 180 opposite decisions and said, oh, well, if I were so faculty, I would have judged it differently.
Oh, so in
And
other words,
I worried about
position
that.
changed them.
And I worry about that. And so one of the things I see my task being is, no, it's still going to be me. And if there's any moment where I'm not being me, I need to quit.
Wow.
And luckily,
do deans typically have that many books in their office?
well, luckily
Associate
mine
dean?
has a lot of books, but
I don't know. I haven't been in many deans' offices, but I've been in a few, and I don't remember that many books typically.
some are designed more functionally, to be fair. But I still see myself primarily as a scholar. I'm still writing, still trying to publish things and whatnot. So I'm still need my tools.
What do you do to stay calm? Does it help you stay calm? I mean, does this give you anxiety doing this work? So, to me, it sounds like it's just problems, constant problems.
Sometimes
How do you look at it?
I don't mind the problems part because I can just say, oh, well, that's part of the junk of running, such a multi-parted operation like a university. But I don't mind that part. I only get nervous when I'm doing procedures that directly affect faculty and their futures. So I get nervous about making sure people's work is being compensated, that merit correctly reflects the work people have done, that people are getting raises that actually help them fight inflation. I get nervous about the procedures where someone could lose a job or someone could decide that they don't like working here with their students. So I get nervous about those things, but I've always been nervous about those things. That's not different as administrator. In terms of keeping calm, reading, of course.
To me, that sounds like you're an idealist, Brad.
I know. I'm often accused of being one. Piano for me is one of the things that calms, in part because music can always reflect your emotional state. So,
and you're good enough at it that you can do that for yourself.
Yeah, if you're angry, there's ample, wonderful, great pieces of piano literature that are angry. When you need to calm down, there are pieces that can do that for you too. There are pieces that are very fingery.
How long did it take you to get to that skill level?
Oh, I've been taking piano for 15 years formally, and then I've played 10 years informally.
So as an adult?
Yeah. All of my classical education has been as an adult. I did church piano, as we would call it, prior to that.
You learned piano as an adult.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
Because it's one of the things I wanted to learn as a child. It's just
I've always thought of it like ballet. I mean, if you don't start really young, you're pretty much screwed. But you're different.
Yeah, no, that's not true.
Okay.
In this sense, I will never be a concert pianist. I did start too late for that. There are pieces of piano literature I will never be able to play.
Could be in your backyard.
True. But I'm not playing Carnegie Hall. Move it that way.
Right. Okay.
So it's like that.
Yeah.
Music's nice because at any level, as long as you're making music you enjoy, it can be pleasant. And so everyone can study music as an adult. I wanted to learn as a child. It's just we couldn't have afforded piano lessons. We didn't know anyone who would teach piano.
How much do they cost?
Well, a good piano, like an upright piano, would be like $7,000 in today's money. It would be less then when I was a kid, but we didn't have that. That wouldn't have been the kind of money my parents would have been able to spend on.
What was your initial layout for these piano lessons that you were like, okay, I'm going to learn piano. I got to
Yeah.
buy a piano. I got to hire somebody.
Yeah.
What was your layout for that in terms of cost?
Well, grand piano.
You got a grand, piano?
No, I do not.
Okay.
Upright piano. I paid like $7,500 and made
Wow.
payments, for like 5 years on. My piano teacher here in LA is a Juilliard trained pianist. And so lessons started at $70. They're now like $80. That's inflation for you. Every week.
When you say every week, you mean once a week?
I take a lesson once every week.
Once a week. How long's the lesson?
1 hour.
Okay. And then you just practice until the next week?
Yeah. And of course, the lesson is more about how to practice. And so I'm working on this.
Oh, that's
how
cool.
do you practice?
Oh, interesting.
And then your teacher gives you
that's very helpful.
The technique exercises and things to help you do that.
How to practice
to do that. And I'm now at a level where there's also a lot of, analysis of form and making sure I don't, sprain my wrist. And
was that really important to you to get the Juilliard trained? Were you like, I'm getting
that's
Juilliard?
not, that wasn't a
just
part
happened to be that way.
It just so happened to be that. One of the nice things about being in Los Angeles is that you can have, compared to having grown up in rural Kentucky,
right,
is you just have access to things.
Yeah, there's a lot of performers
I never had.
Yeah, that's true.
And so when I became a professor here in LA.
Did you know that you wanted to move to LA when you were at Memphis?
It was where the job was.
Okay.
And so I came out.
You're not like, oh, I'm going to LA. I can't wait to go to LA and
just
run into Brad Pitt.
Over the idea.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
I would have been perfectly fine going back to Georgetown College and being a professor there. In terms of being a professor, it turned out to be in LA. LA gave me the opportunity to connect more with different people. And so when I became a professor, instead of buying like a new car, I just kept my old beat up grad student car.
Well, yeah, you had to spend $7,500 on a piano.
Right.
That's what most people would spend on a car.
But to be fair, I mean, you're a lover of books too, and people are always like, why do you not drive a nice car? Because I buy books. I have to take piano lessons, stuff like that. You can see, where the priorities lie. I don't have fancy clothes. I don't drive a nice car. I just have a lot of books.
Yeah. Well, Brad, how are you doing on time? I know we've gone over what you've said.
Yeah. I think
cut it out.
We're approaching an end.
Okay. Well, you've definitely given us a lot to think about, and we've enjoyed getting to know you very much, Brad.
No, thank you for the opportunity, and to reflect
spending the time on us.
Reflect on how wonderful. When I tell stories about the way I grew up, this always comes to mind. I guess I'll say this is my ending. Just kind of. We live in an America that always thinks that the people who live in the rural world are just some group of animals. I don't know how to describe it, but what a tender place I grew up in, and it had real community and people that were willing to invest in me upon seeing where my passions were. And I had a wonderful upbringing. And I always try to remind people, as our culture becomes more and more urban, so even your rural parts of the United States are now urban-like.
Yeah.
Let's not lose some of that. Let's try to stay agrarian. Always know where our food comes from. Have an appreciation for neighbors.
Yeah.
And actually depend on them.
Wow. What a concept.
Those ideas exist in small town America.
Mm-hmm.
And
there's also a lot of gossip. But
That's
there's
not news.
gossip in Los Angeles.
Oh yeah,
Just in print. It's just in print.
yeah. But it's like,
Well, I can see that attitude of this ending of the reflection on rural America. I see it in the way you take your current job seriously. Like you're bringing that like, hey, this is almost like a neighborhood, the university, and we need to cycle in people that some of these to try to get rid of. Well, we need to cycle in people in some of these administrative roles to fight this administrative bloat.
right.
Yeah, it's very small town.
It is, I was about to say, indeed, small town where everyone gets a turn being the night watchman.
Yeah,
Um,
it's cool.
in a volunteer fire department. Sometimes we've got to,
Like how the Navy is. That's
yeah,
exactly how the Navy thinks about things. Like we had to stand watch when I was a kid, and I never you don't understand it as when you're going through boot camp, you have to stand watch. When you're in training in school, when I was in school in my training, they made you stand watch. Then you're not on a ship. Well, they wanted to train you. This is where we have to look out for each other. There's always somebody awake. And there's usually always two people awake. Actually, that's how it works in the Navy. And everybody has to cycle through that role so that everybody knows the bigger picture
Mhm.
of, because you see things at night that nobody else sees, and you'd never even think about that, like where the fire escapes are,
yeah,
and whether that door is locked, and um, just there's all sorts of things that you never think about, and it's even more important on a ship actually.
yeah,
But yeah, that's how you that's what I hear you saying.
yeah. And the good news is you didn't have to pay for another night watchman.
Right, that's true too. That's
And
right.
that's what I'm interested in seeing in higher education.
Well, thank you for joining us, Dr. Brad Elliott Stone.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.